I'm going to create a series of videos for you showing you how to create the illusion of three-dimensional form using different tools in Illustrator, such as gradients, object blends, and the gradient mesh tool. Before I get started on that, I want to just go over a basic review of shading. So the value or the lightness or darkness of an object depends on two things. First of all, the native color of that object or the native value of the object. How light or how dark is the object itself? So for example, something like the liver or the spleen is always going to be darker than another structure like the brain, just because of the inherent color or native color of that object. The other thing that influences the value or the shading of an object is, or the lightness or darkness of an object, is the position of that object relative to some light source. How is the object oriented relative to that light source? And you see in this upper example that I've drawn some simple cubes, and there are three different faces of each cube that are visible. There's one face here on the left which is facing directly towards the light source, so that's going to have the lightest value. The top surface is oriented at kind of an oblique angle relative to the light source, so that has an intermediate value. And then this third surface is facing away from the light source, or at least is rotated somewhat away from the light source, so that has the darkest value. And then actually there's a cast shadow which has an even darker value because the cube is blocking all of the light source from hitting the surface behind it. With something like a sphere, one portion of that sphere is facing directly towards the light source. And so you have very intense lighting hitting that part of the object and reflecting directly back to the viewer. And that gives us the appearance of a highlight. Surrounding the highlight, we have an area known as the midtone, or some people call it a halftone. And this area is also reflecting light back towards the viewer, but not with the same intensity as the highlight. Typically, we think of the midtone as being the inherent color or the native color of the object. So this would be whatever the actual color of the object is. The highlight would actually be lighter than that because there'd be so much light coming back towards the viewer. The middle of the sphere, think of it as sort of the fat part of the sphere, is then blocking light from hitting the opposite side of the sphere. And so this creates a core shadow. Really, it's almost like a cast shadow, but the sphere is casting a shadow onto itself because that fat part, that equator of the sphere, is blocking light from hitting the other side. Then, just beyond the core shadow, we typically have something called a reflected light. Now, if this sphere was just floating out in space, it probably wouldn't have a reflected light because there'd be nothing nearby for light to reflect off of. But if we have some other object nearby, in this case we have a surface, like a table that the sphere is resting on, there's light that's coming down from our light source and hitting that surface, and a little bit of it reflects up onto the underside of the object to create a little bit of reflected light, which is directly opposite where our light source is coming from. And then once again we have a cast shadow, and the cast shadow is typically even darker than the core shadow. Here we see a cylinder that's illuminated the same way. Once again, our light source is coming over from the upper left, but also coming from out in front of the object a little bit. So you can almost think of the light source as being over your left shoulder as you're looking at this object. So in the case of a cylinder, we also have a highlight, which is the narrow band which is facing most directly towards the light source, and therefore it's reflecting the maximum amount of light back towards the viewer. But then the midtone lies on both sides of that highlight. It lies a little bit to the left and a little bit to the right of that highlight. And again, that's what we think of as being sort of the inherent color or native color of the object. Then that midtone transitions to a core shadow. Once again, you can think of it, the fat part of the cylinder is blocking a little bit of the light from reaching the opposite side, away from the light source. You may have a little bit of core shadow way over on the far left, as well as a larger core shadow here on the far right. And then once again, we have reflected light, where there's light coming off of the table surface or off of other nearby objects and then reflecting back towards the surface of the cylinder directly opposite where the highlight is. And again, we have a cast shadow. Let me show you how to use gradients then to simulate the appearance of the different parts of a sphere first. We're going to create what's called a radial gradient. So I need to bring up my gradient palette. I've drawn a circle already. I'm going to select the circle. And when you want to add a gradient to the fill color of any object, you want to make sure in your color palette that the fill is actually selected, or you can also do that here in the gradient palette. It is possible now to add a gradient to the stroke, but that's something that I rarely do. Typically, I'm just going to put gradients inside the fill color. So make sure that the fill is active, and then just click on the default gradient that shows up in the gradient palette. Usually by default, it's going to bring up a linear gradient, but you also have the ability to choose what's called a radial gradient or something new called a freeform gradient. In this case, since I'm drawing a sphere, I want a radial gradient, so I'm going to click on the radial gradient icon here where it says type in the gradient palette. Now, just to orient you to what you're seeing here, there's a little bar down at the bottom of the gradient palette that currently has two little circles at the bottom. These are known as gradient sliders. You can see when I hover over them, that name pops up. There's a white gradient slider here at the far left, and that corresponds to the very center of the radial gradient that you see in our object. You can almost think of it as like the bullseye on a target. And then there's another gradient slider over here at the far right, which is currently colored in solid black. And that represents the very outside of our radial gradient. So the very outside of this circular gradient here within this shape. I can easily change the colors of these two sliders by simply clicking on them. There's actually a couple ways to do this. You can click directly on one of the sliders. You see how it's highlighted in blue. And if I have my color palette open, the color palette changes to the color of that currently selected slider. Alternatively, I could double click, I could double click on the slider and it would bring up a little mini version of the color palette. So if you work with your color palette hidden, I'll just push it over here, then you can just bring up that same thing by just double clicking right on one of those sliders. I tend to work with my color palette open all the time, so I just use the color palette itself. If I want to change one of these colors, it's very simple to just go up here to the color palette and make a little change to it. I can move the sliders around, so I could drag this highlight slider or this white slider to the right. And you see what that does in our circle over here. It just expands the size of the white area in the middle. Or I could do the opposite. I could take the black slider, drag it to the right. That causes that dark color to compress in towards the middle. I can also add sliders to my gradient by simply clicking in this empty space below the gradient bar. And that adds a slider. So let me show you how I would go about creating something that looks just like a sphere. So if you go back to our example way over on the far left, there are 4 different values that I need to create a convincing sphere. I need my highlight value, my midtone value, my core shadow value, and then finally a reflected light value on that sphere. Right now I have 3 sliders. I'm going to take this solid black one, move it to the left a little bit, and that's going to make a little bit more space over here on the right. I'm going to click and add yet another slider there. So now I have one for my highlight, one for my midtone, core shadow, and reflected light. Now I need to figure out what values to make these things. And generally speaking, when I create gradients, I always like to start with the midtone color, because I'm going to assume that midtone is the native object, the native color of the object, the inherent color. So that's the actual color of the object. And then the highlight is going to be a much lighter version of that. The core shadow and reflected light will be darker versions. So let's say I want to create a sphere that's, say, 50% gray. I'd select my midtone highlight, enter 50% gray for my color. My highlight is going to be a much lighter version of that. And the value that I choose for my highlight is going to affect the appearance of this object, obviously, but I can actually simulate different kinds of materials depending on how bright that highlight is. And also, I'll show you in a few minutes, I can make that highlight have either a harder, crisper edge, or I can have it have a soft, diffuse edge. So I can simulate the appearance of something that's very shiny, like a smooth plastic surface, or alternatively, I could create something that looks more like a diffuse highlight, like a soft, fuzzy highlight. If I want to make something that's very specular, that has a very bright, shiny highlight, I'm going to leave this highlight as being pure white. And then there's some little tricks I can do to give it more of a hard-edged highlight. I can move this over a little bit. And then in addition to being able to move the little sliders around, there are also these little diamonds that appear up at the top of the little gradient bar. If I take this diamond that lies between the highlight and midtone and I push it over to the left, what that does is it pushes the midtone color closer to the highlight slider, and it causes a much more abrupt change, a much more hard-edged change from my highlight to my midtone, which is going to give this more of an appearance of a specular highlight like you'd see on a shiny, hard plastic surface. If I want a highlight that's more diffuse, like you'd have on something with a softer surface that's not hard plastic and shiny, then you'd simply leave this diamond back where it was, creating more of a soft, gradual, fuzzy transition from the highlight to the midtone. Next thing I would do is I'd create my core shadow. I'll move this over just a little bit. Generally, the core shadow is not going to be 100% solid black. The only way you'd get 100% solid black core shadow is if you had a really, really intense spotlight so that the shadow ended up being really super, super dark. So generally, obviously I want it to be darker than the midtone, but not necessarily 100%. So I might set this down to say, something like 80%. And then my reflected light is going to be even a little bit lighter than that. The reflected light is not going to be quite as light as the midtone, but it's going to be a little bit lighter than our core shadow. So I'll select the reflected light shadow and make this maybe 70%. So it's a little bit lighter than the core shadow, but not as light as the midtone. So now if you look at our circle, you see we've got the highlight color in the middle, surrounded by midtone, surrounded by core shadow, and just barely shows up. Let me make that a little bit lighter. Let's try 60. And then you can start to see the reflected light around the outside. It still doesn't look anything like a sphere because right now, it just sort of looks like a target, like a bullseye. To make it look convincingly like a sphere, I need to reposition the highlight, midtone, core shadow, and reflected light within the object. And I can reposition a gradient inside an object by using the gradient tool over here in the tool palette. When I select that gradient tool, and if I actually have an object with a gradient selected, it brings up this little bar here that's known as the gradient annotator. And it's kind of like a miniature version of the gradient bar that I see over here in my gradient palette. As a matter of fact, I can reposition the different sliders right on the gradient annotator without even having to go into my gradient palette. I can even double click directly on the sliders on the gradient annotator to bring up my color palette, just like I could do over here. So really, you don't even need the gradient palette open at this point. You can just make edits right on the gradient annotator. But in order to reposition this gradient within this circular shape, I need to reposition my gradient annotator. Now I can just pick it up and move it around, but that's not necessarily going to put it where I want it, or change the position of all of the other components of the annotator. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to click and I'm going to drag with the mouse to completely reposition the gradient annotator. The way I do this with a sphere, if I'm thinking about, upper left-hand lighting, as we normally do in scientific illustration, I'm going to try to picture the upper left quadrant of this circle. So if I picture this circle divided into 4 square areas, or 4 quadrants, what I'm going to do with my gradient annotator is I'm going to click initially right in the middle of that upper left quadrant. Clicking with the mouse, but I'm holding the mouse button down. I'm going to now drag the gradient annotator right through the center point of the circle, come all the way down here to the bottom right edge of the circle, and when I've got it right at the very bottom right edge of the circle, now I let go with the mouse. And now you can see what I've done as I've repositioned the highlight here in the upper left, surrounded by its midtone. The core shadow falls right around the equator of the sphere, and then it transitions to reflected light down below. Now that I've done that, I can make further refinements to my sphere. As I said earlier, I could make this look more like a specular highlight by maybe pushing the highlight over a little bit to make it a little bigger, but then taking that diamond between the highlight and midtone sliders, pushing it to the left to create more of a hard-edged specular highlight. I can also play around with the core shadow. I could take this diamond that lies between midtone and core shadow and push it to the right a little bit, and that's going to create more of a defined edge between the midtone and core shadow. I could also take the diamond between the core shadow and the reflected light, push it to the right a little bit, which is going to scrunch up or compress the reflected light color. So by just moving sliders around, changing their colors, moving these little diamonds around, I can change the distribution of the gradient, which is actually going to change essentially imitate different surface textures of the material that the sphere is made out of. Let me show you the same thing with a linear gradient to simulate the appearance of a cylinder. I'm going to click on the default gradient here, which happens to be whichever the last gradient was that I chose. So since I was previously working with a radial gradient, now when I click on the default gradient here in the gradient palette, it brings up that radial gradient, which clearly that's not what I want for my cylinder. So I need to change the gradient type to linear. It's still keeping the same values that I had before. Let me use those same values to create the appearance of my cylinder. I'm going to need to move the core shadow over a little bit. I'm going to move the midtone over a little bit, because now I need to reposition that highlight somewhere over here so that it falls just to the left of center of the cylinder. And now I need to add a new midtone and a new core shadow over to the left. So one thing I could do is I could add a new slider by clicking below the bar, and that could be my new midtone slider. Let me just double check the color or the value of my original midtone. That was 50% gray. So I could select this one and also make it 50% gray. So now I've added a new midtone. And now I could add a fourth or an additional slider over here at the very far left and make that the same color as my core shadow. Let me show you a quick little trick. In fact, I'm gonna delete this midtone slider that I just created. If you want to get rid of a slider that you've created, simply grab it and just kind of drag it right off the palette, and it deletes it. But here's a little trick to make this go even faster, instead of creating new sliders over here and having to go in and edit their colors, if I hold down the Option key on the Mac keyboard, and I think that's Alt in Windows, I can click any slider, drag it, and duplicate it. That's with the Option key held down. Same thing with the Core Shadow slider. Hold down the Option key, drag, and it duplicates it. So I can very quickly and easily duplicate the sliders on the left, the same ones that I have on the right. So now we have something that looks a little bit more like a cylinder. And I can play around with the diamonds and the position of the midtone. I can move these diamonds on either side of the highlight just to make subtle little tweaks to the distribution of the values on this thing to make it look more like a cylinder. If I actually want to create the rounded bottom to the cylinder, this has nothing to do with gradients, but let me just show you how I would do that. I take the anchor point tool and click on the corner points at the bottom and just drag a rounded edge down. And you might notice that cylinder has a subtle sense of perspective. So I can just take the white arrow and just nudge these bottom points a little closer to one another, create a little subtle sense of perspective. And then for the top surface, I just use my ellipse tool and just draw an ellipse up here for the top surface. And then just give that a gray value. And you can easily create the appearance of a cylinder. To create versions of these gradients that have color in them, normally I would start the same way, and of course I would just colorize my sliders. I'm going to use this same gradient and just make changes to the existing sliders and talk a little bit about color. So when I want to create a colored gradient as opposed to one that's just grayscale, I'm going to select one of my sliders. Typically going to start with the midtone again because I want to know, what is my native color of my object. In the color palette, I need to change this from grayscale to CMYK or RGB, but I'm working entirely in CMYK here. And let's make this a red ball. So I need to put in some magenta and yellow. And there we've got a bright kind of orangey red. For my highlight, I want to create a lighter version of that same color. Now, if it's a truly specular highlight, and I'm going to scrunch up the highlight, so it has that kind of hard edge, then I could potentially leave this pure white. But normally I'm not going to create a true specular highlight. I'm going to put a little bit of value in here so it's not pure white. So I need to select that slider, change it to CMYK, and I might just put a small amount of those same colors in here. Core shadow is a little trickier because there's some things you need to remember about shading, some general principles about shading. That core shadow is not just a darker version of the same color. So when I switch to CMYK, let me get rid of the black. Since my midtone, I think I said what was it, 80 and 80? Yeah, for magenta and yellow. I can't just make this 100 and 100 and say, oh, that's a darker version of the same color, because first of all, it's not really that much darker, but also it's more saturated. It's even more vivid than the midtone color. And a general principle with core shadows is that core shadows are always less saturated than the midtone color. So not only is the core shadow darker, but it's also going to be less saturated. So if anything, I'd actually reduce the amount of magenta and yellow a little bit. So instead of 80 and 80, I've got 70 and 70 for magenta and yellow. Because it's less saturated, I might throw in just a little bit of contaminant color. So a little bit of that blue or cyan. And then I can create a darker version by just throwing in some black as well. So now I've got something that looks like a real dark brown, where it's got some of that same magenta and yellow, but also a little cyan and a little black. And of course I could make this even darker by boosting the amount of black. My reflected light is just going to be a lighter version of that. So I could just select this slider and have to switch this to CMYK. Or here's another little trick that I use. I'm going to just tear off this reflected light slider, add a new slider over here at the right, and that automatically picks up the color of the slider next to it. So it's automatically exactly the same color as my core shadow. I'm just going to reduce the amounts of cyan and especially the amount of black in here to create my reflected light. And I could probably go even a little more, maybe reduce the magenta and yellow a teeny bit and reduce the black more, just show that the reflected light shows up more. One more principle about the colors on a radial gradient like this. Remember that the reflected light is created because of the reflection of light off of nearby objects. Well, if you have a nearby object that has a lot of color in it, like imagine that this sphere is actually sitting on a surface that is, let me think of a good color here. So imagine that that circle was sitting on a green table. The reflected light is going to be picking up not only light reflected off of that green table, but also the color that's reflected from the green. So it's going to pick up some of that reflected green. So that means that my reflected light needs to actually be a different color. It can't just be a lighter version of the core shadow. We would actually probably have a bunch more cyan in here, probably less of the magenta. We'll leave the yellow alone because green is made by combining cyan and magenta. So let me actually reduce the magenta, green is made from combining cyan and yellow. So what I'm doing here is I'm boosting the amount of cyan and yellow and reducing the amount of magenta to create a reflected light which has a noticeable green cast to it because it's picking up green reflected off of that surface. The last thing I would probably draw in here would be my cast shadow, and I'm just going to kind of wing that quickly by hand. I draw a shape in here that kind of simulates a little bit the color of the circle. I'm going to take the black stroke off of all of these things. And then for my cast shadow, with a cast shadow, the color of the cast shadow is controlled by two things. Obviously, you're blocking whatever the light source is, so it's going to be dark, but it's also probably going to pick up some of whatever the native color is of the object that the shadow is being cast onto. So I'm going to start with that same green color and just make a much darker version of that green just by throwing some more black in there. So now you start to get the illusion of an actual red ball sitting on a green table. Let me show you some real examples, some real medical artwork that uses both radial and linear gradients. Here's a page full of radial gradients. This is illustration of the hepatitis B virus that I created a number of years ago. And this one contains a whole bunch of radial gradients. First of all, there's the what's called the nucleocapsid, which is a cluster of proteins that surrounds the genetic material in the interior of the virus. And each of these you can see has a radial gradient to it. I'll just redraw one off to the side so you can see it. And it's got your typical highlight. It's actually got two sliders for the midtone, just to expand the midtone, and then core shadow and reflected light. There's also a green gradient out there. Let me just use my eyedropper tool and pick it up here. Similar arrangement. We've got a subtle highlight, two sliders for the midtone just to make the midtone a little wider, core shadow, and then reflected light. If you look closely at the reflected light here, you'll see that the reflected light has noticeably more cyan in it. It's a little bit bluer looking than the rest of the gradient, probably because I wanted to simulate the idea that there was some blue from the surface of this virus reflecting on those surface proteins. The outside of the virus also has gradients in it. If I select this green ball down here and click on that gradient, you can actually see that there's a similar blue gradient that's applied to the outside of the virus surface. Now the virus surface, if I try to dissect this apart, is actually made up of a whole bunch of these little repeating blobs. They all have the same gradient located inside of them. Let me try something to show you that you can actually use the gradient tool to reposition the gradient annotator across a whole bunch of separate objects all simultaneously. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't work so well. I'm going to select one of those little shapes that makes up the outside of the virus. I'm going to select same fill and stroke, which will select everything with that same fill color and stroke color. I'm going to deselect this sphere over here because I want to make sure I keep that shape. And I'm just going to go ahead and fill all those shapes with black. And just because I want to simulate the way I would create this. So I could have created all of those little shapes in one solid color. In this case, create them all black. And then with all of those shapes selected, I could then pick up and apply a gradient color from another object. So I'm going to use my eyedropper and apply the color of this sphere down here in the bottom right. And that has now applied this same gradient to every one of those shapes. Let me hide the edges again. It's a little hard to tell, but if we zoom in here, I think you can tell that every one of those has the same gradient in it. The problem is I want that gradient to be distributed across all of these shapes the way I did earlier in the example where I showed you how to reposition the gradient annotator to make something look like a sphere. I'm going to go back and make the edges visible again. I'm going to select my gradient tool, and when I do that, normally this would show that every single one of these objects had its own little gradient annotator inside of it. I'm not sure why it's not showing that right now. But let me show you what I would do here. I'm going to reposition this gradient across this entire cluster of shapes by clicking with the gradient tool here towards the upper left, dragging towards the bottom right, just as if I were applying a gradient to a single sphere. And now when I hide the edges, you can see what it's done. It's applied that that single gradient across many, many shapes simultaneously. So now I have sort of a highlight here towards the upper left, transitioning to a midtone, and then down to the shadow color below. Now you might notice that there are also a few of these objects that are colored a little darker. There's a different gradient in here. It's actually similar to the original gradient, it's just that it's a little bit darker in value in every position. So the highlight value is a little darker, the midtone values are a little darker, the core shadow value is a little darker. And I just changed the color of a few of these little objects on the surface of the virus to try to simulate the effect of a cast shadow, where, for example, this green protein here, imagine it casting a shadow onto these neighboring objects. Maybe I'd select this one as well, take my eyedropper, and simply pick up that different value. And that's giving a slight suggestion that this surface protein is casting a little shadow onto these neighboring objects. Close up, it's not real convincing, but as I zoom out more, I think it does create the desired appearance where there's a series of little cast shadows on the surface of the virus. Some other examples here, this spherical part of this fungus, you can tell that there's a radial gradient in there, as well as a different radial gradient in every one of these little orange spores that are being reduced or released from this part of the fungus. You've seen examples like this before in the scientific visualization class, where I've created different gradients for each of the elements. And then this eye over here actually contains a number of different radial gradients. Let me create a separate little sphere here so that you can see what these gradients look like. I'm going to pick up my eyedropper tool. There's a radial gradient for the sclera at the very outside of the eye. There's a radial gradient for the choroid, which is the vascular layer of the eye, and a radial gradient for the outer surface, this little piece of the retina that's visible. There's also another gradient for the inside of the retina, and it's still a radial gradient, but if I'm able to select the retina, and this may be tricky because this is a multi-layered file. See, that's the edge of the retina. I'm going to lock that, see if I can select the inside. Okay, there's the inside of the retina. If I grab my gradient tool, my gradient annotator shows up. You can see that I positioned the center of the gradient, the lighter part of the gradient, down here at the bottom, because since we're looking at a cutaway view into the eye, the area down here near the bottom of the retina is going to actually be catching some light, whereas up here at the top, this is all going to be in shadow because the light is being blocked by by these layers of the eye. If I take the gradient, I could even reposition this again. If I take the gradient annotator and click and drag, I can reposition exactly where that highlight and shadow land. You notice the vessels in here. The vessels also contain gradients, and if I take my eyedropper tool and click on, say, the blue veins, you'll see there's a gradient in the veins and also a gradient in the arteries. What's happening here is that in the center of the gradient, which you can see here in the gradient palette, there's a red color, but then the gradient transitions to the light and dark colors of the retina. And if I were to select the retina, I get hold of it. There's the retina, and the object for the veins, and the object for the arteries. I could do something similar to what I showed you with the virus before. I can take my gradient tool and I could distribute that same gradient across all three objects simultaneously. So by clicking and dragging with the gradient annotator tool with all three of these shapes selected, I can simultaneously apply a gradient in the retina, the artery, and the vein. And I may not have made the artery and vein gradients correctly. Let me try that again. I'm going to hide the edges, but I can still apply the gradient. The idea here is that I'm trying to get the arteries and veins to fade into the color of both the light part and the shaded part of the retina. So that's another use for gradients, is actually to allow one object to fade into an object behind it. Right, let me now show you some examples of linear gradients. I've got a whole bunch of these. Start over here with the DNA because these are fairly simple. This is obviously a ribbon type illustration of DNA. It's fairly schematic, but it's actually based on a model that I exported from Chimera, because even in this simple schematic, I wanted the proportions of everything to be exactly correct. So you'll see that the DNA double helix has distinct grooves. There's something called the minor groove, which is 6 angstroms in size. The major groove is 12 angstroms in size. The diameter of the entire double helix is 20 angstroms. A single pitch, which is, in other words, a single complete 360-degree rotation of the helix, is 34 angstroms in length. There's also 10 base pairs in a single pitch, a single complete 360-degree twist. So I wanted everything to be perfectly accurate here. But once I got the proportions accurate, then I just created simple linear gradients here to create the different parts of the DNA helix. And in fact, what I did in a case like this is I would just draw rectangles, take the white arrow, which is going to allow me to select just, say, one edge of this, and then drag it up like that to skew it. And then I could take the anchor point tool and start to create the curvature of these parts of the helix. And then do the opposite here, pull these down. And then, you just got to make some little fine adjustments and little tweaks. A bunch of other linear gradients. I think you've seen this drill before. Each of these shapes is really just a rectangle filled in with a linear gradient. These are obviously not just rectangles, but they've been modified slightly. There's some other shapes here that have different kinds of gradients in them. But you look closely at each one of these pieces, it's literally just a rectangle or a slightly modified rectangle with a linear gradient in it. To create the appearance of a shiny metallic surface, there's some little tricks you can use. There's no substitute for just looking very closely at a shiny piece of metal to try to understand what it is that makes it look metallic. For one thing, it's very high contrast. Very bright, shiny highlight, typically fairly dark shadows. but also you typically have like multiple, not really highlights, but multiple different values that almost simulate the appearance of reflections. So if I select this object and we look at the, let's try that again. It must be grouped with something because it's trying to select multiple objects. All right, I select it with the white arrow, and you can see just how complex this gradient is. There's a highlight slider here with sort of a mid-tone slider on either side of it, but then there's a very dark shadow, and then it gets light again, and then goes dark again. So that a lot of that was just trial and error, trying to simulate the appearance of metal. If you look at the gradient for something like this object, even though this one looks a lot simpler, if you look closely at it, you see that there's actually a little bit of gold showing up in here. That's because it's actually reflecting the gold of the neighboring parts of the drill. These IV bags, simple linear gradient there, another linear gradient for the top surface of the fluid, and there's even a linear gradient for the interior of the bag. And you notice that this one's darker on the left and gets lighter on the right. That's because if you're looking at the interior of an object, it's going to be shaded on the left where the light's being blocked. It's going to be lighter on the right-hand side where the light can actually get through and hit it. Let me show you one other example in a little bit more detail. Actually, I'm going to show you two more examples. This pill bottle with the pills inside. And it hopefully, if I did it right, it looks like there's some pills that are ghosted transparently inside. And I think you all know that I'm not a big fan of transparency for a number of reasons. There is no transparency in this illustration. Those pills are not transparent inside the bottle. So the pills themselves are not transparent, and the bottle is not transparent. This whole thing is grouped. Let's see if I can get hold of the pills individually. Move them off to the side. I think one more. All right, so there's all the pills. So let me move them over here. And just to prove it to you that there's no transparency, I'll pull up the transparency palette and you can see their normal 100% opacity. So to create that illusion, let me move this little shape over as well. The bottle itself just has a simple linear gradient in it. It's got a highlight which is fairly subtle with mid-tone on both sides of it and coarse shadow both sides of that, and then a little bit of reflected light at the far right. This highlight here is not part of the gradient. That highlight is actually yet another object. So now you can actually see the gradient itself. Let me get rid of the label. So to create the pills, I'm just going to go ahead and fill them all in with solid black. What I did is I just drew this little jumble of objects. Right on top of the pill bottle. And then I used my eyedropper tool to select the exact same gradient that was present in the pill bottle. So they're now all filled in with that same gradient. I'm going to select my gradient tool, and I'm going to distribute the gradient in the pills from left to right across the pill bottle exactly the same as the way the gradient is distributed in the bottle itself. If I were to hide the edges, you see that the pills just seem to disappear. because the pills are filled with the exact same gradient as the bottle, and I've now distributed the gradient across all of the pills in exactly the same orientation as the gradient in the bottle itself. So that makes them appear to go away. So then to make the pills actually show up, I go into my gradient tool, and I'm going to select the midtone value, and I'm just going to add some more magenta to it because these are red pills. And I can do maybe not quite so much. Let's go a little bit less. Same thing with the midtone on the other side. Core shadow. Other core shadow. And maybe add just a little bit more magenta to the reflected light. Notice I didn't change the value of the highlight. And that little trick makes it appear as though the highlight is on the outside of the bottle, and the highlight is then resting over the pills, and that's one of the things that gives us the illusion of transparency here. Then I added this additional shape, which also has a a radial gradient in it. I keep using the wrong tool here. Since everything's grouped, if I use the black arrow, it selects everything. Let me move this highlight object back over. And this is just another linear gradient that goes from very light up at the top to the same orange as the highlight of the pill bottle. So if I look at the highlight on the pill bottle, it's 30 and 60. And if I look at this highlight and select this end, it's also 30 and 60. So what that means is that the bottom of this additional shape just kind of blends in with the highlight that's been applied to the bottle and the pills. I think I gotta reposition it a little bit, or maybe drag it down a little bit. There we go. So those two things of number one, having the highlight on the pills be the identical color as the highlight on the bottle itself gives that illusion of transparency, and then adding this additional shape over top also helps to sort of help with that illusion that we've got a shiny highlight on the outside of the plastic pill bottle. And then this object here just represents the base of the pill bottle, which you can see transparently through the shape. This one also started out as the same color, the same gradient as the rest of the bottle. It's just that I made the shadows darker, and I think I may have put on just a little bit of black into the midtones. But once again, left the highlight color of that shape exactly the same as the highlight of the bottle and the pills, and that creates that illusion of the base of the bottle. One final one to show you here. This is a spacer for an inhaler for asthma. Once again, there's no transparency here. This object here, if you look at glass and study glass, you try to understand what makes something look glassy. It's actually a little bit similar to metal. It has a fairly bright highlight. The shadows aren't typically as dark, but one thing with glass is that oftentimes you'll have a highlight and then it'll actually be flanked by a fairly dark midtone color on both sides, and then may get lighter again and then go back to a little shadow again. It has a bit of a transparent look, primarily because of this object. If I get hold of it. Oh, that's right, I got my edges hidden. That's supposed to represent the back of that sort of tan thing. And when I look at this now, I realize that I drew the shape kind of inaccurately. This should probably be a little closer in there. And this Should probably look more like that. I think that's a little bit more accurate. But this also started out as, like a different colored object. Just imagine that that's just a solid black object. And then I'm just going to pick up the same gradient that I created for the clear transparent part of the spacer. I'm going to take my gradient tool and I'm going to reorient that gradient so its orientation matches the orientation of the rest of the spacer. And get rid of the stroke color. Now if I hide the edge, you can see the object just pretty much completely disappears. You can't see it at all because it's got the same gradient in the same orientation as the rest of the spacer. Then all I need to do is just go to that gradient and make different parts of it a little darker. What I might do is add a little bit more magenta and a little bit of yellow to kind of simulate the tan color of that object. And a little of that here. But I'm leaving the highlight alone. Leave the highlight the same color so that then it really looks like the highlight is on the outside of this plastic tube, and the highlight is then superimposed over that object in the background. Oh, just a few other examples, all using linear gradients. So that's it for gradients. I gave you a basic shading review, showed you how to create radial gradients and linear gradients. We'll come back next with a video about object blends.